The speaker this evening, as you know, is DavidClaerbout. I don't know where I was the first time I saw something that I took to be a film. There was a ball in the air, and there were lots of people, and they moved around, and they were adults and children. And then suddenly I realized that the ball hadn't moved at all. And I couldn't work this out, but it stuck in my mind for many years, so it remains my favorite piece. You might have seen it in London. DavidClaerbout has said that photographs are films that keep their mouths shut. I think it was appropriate, that statement. His work, in some sense, lies between films and photographs. He subverts the time of the photograph and he disrupts the movement of the film. He produces his own kind of movement from the surface of still images. We think of the photograph as a still image, and we think of film as moving image. Film, of course, has its own notion of continuity, but Claerbout wants to reinvent the meaning of continuity. He would like 3 prints from 3 different times, before, now, and after, to be able to occupy the same surface, the same picture. He has a well-known work, is the one I've just described, Sections of a Happy Moment, in which a point in time and the cost of time are woven into one, where he draws out a moment, one moment, for 26 minutes. The audience experiences its strange virtual movement, although time isn't really going by, in what François Partey has called an astonishing manufacture of the real. I realize that what I'm saying is not entirely comprehensible. It seems unimaginable that one could invest the photograph with the future and deprive film from the here and now. I hope DavidClaerbout could say something about his use of the digital in unlocking the flow of time in a static situation. You may have seen his work I've been talking about. It has been shown from Paris to San Francisco, and you may well have seen it in London in 2009. Apparently, he's working on some new projects that use animation and 3D. And I believe he will tell us more about this work this evening. Please welcome to David.
I usually work in chapters of small groups of work, 2, 3, maximum 4 pieces, which loosely form a series. And the reason why I kind of tend to work in series is not so much because I have a lack of ideas, or I have one bright idea every year or every second year, but it's because I often feel that things come in 3. A middle, a beginning, and an end. And in this sense, maybe I think like a cinematographer. And the first work will usually be of the greatest excitement, because you never know what's going to come out. And in the second, which can be made often a year or 1.5 years later, you start get into the rhythm, and in the third, it's time to quit. And but I've always liked to, not for every piece, because some pieces are sufficient by themselves. And one of the reasons why I like to work in series, if I may call them that way, is because I try to find out how similar works, or works that have a structure that is very similar, often then we speak about technically and structurally being similar, how nevertheless these individual works within the series can really go a different direction. It's a little bit as if I would try to say hello to somebody in 3 different ways by just uttering the word hello. And so it's an exercise in language, and about how, in fact, you can really say a different thing 3 times with the same uttering. And essentially, I will go about in a chronological way with my first work, what I would call to be my first moving image piece, which was nothing more than an exercise somebody lent me a video camera, and I did have a cat and I did have a bird, and I had an idea about, in fact it was an idea about war, about conflict, and I thought what's interesting in relation to painting, which I had been practicing before, and lithography, is a screen is such a flat thing, and nevertheless, so many things are going on behind it. But when you switch off the button, it's again this flat, ridiculous thing. And since 1996, I've been trying to think about how do you coexist with two entities that could be no different, and how do you nevertheless have them exist together on the same surface. And Cat and Bird in Peace is basically my first exercise, but also maybe the only thing that I ever had to say. And this is before digital. For some reason I've done a few pieces with cats because they are readily available, if they're yours of course, readily available subjects for work, and they usually sleep, so they're always there. And this work is not much more than seven minutes, something like that. But in fact, it's part of a 90-minute high 8 tape that was at the time, and I was so confident in the two animals not hurting one another that I even went down and to the kitchen and back up, and they had changed position, but they didn't touch, which was testified by the video. In fact, the cat is, well, this is a little bit horrible, but the cat is claustrophobic, so it won't move too much. And the bird is clever. And if there was one attack, it was really the bird flying towards the cat. But, so you can understand why I was so keen on working digital after that. And this is basically how I showed the piece. So I'm going to skip some works, and I'll go straight to another work which I believe is not in our show. No. Kindergarten Antonia. It's my first animation, although that is nowadays a big word for a very simple thing. And after I'd been doing painting, and essentially I was never good for anything else than being an artist, so I'd done a lot of painting. By the time I was 23, and I slowly moved on to photography because I felt that I was mainly painting and drawing after photographs, so why not just deal with the real thing and abandon all this artistry and go deeper into photography. And in fact, I did that by not doing anything at all. For several years, I just observed my archive. I scanned and reproduced a lot of imagery, and so usually my daily practice comes down to being in a library or on the internet nowadays, essentially doing nothing but gathering stuff that is of no importance whatsoever, and where the biggest criterion would be that in fact there is no focus in my research. So try to explain that in a scientific way, that in fact the only way you can get to something is by losing attention and essentially looking from the corner of your eye. And that's how I gathered my material, as well in the beginning as still today. And so I work with small incentives, things that work for me, that give me ideas about how they could lead an animated life. And when I speak about animated life, I mean it very literal, not so much in technological terms, but in the sense that where this photography at one point could be curated into something else, could be taken care of, and taken care of as if it were a living being. And that means bringing it into another sort of state. And Kindergarten Antonio Santelia was one of my first exercises in that. It lasts about 60 minutes, and it's a small animation based on a found picture. The picture came from the archives of Giuseppe Terragni, who's an Italian architect who was better known, I think, as one of the architects of Italian fascism. And probably because there's a very strong aesthetical side to the architecture of Italy of that time, there's of course also a strong occupation with promise and with light in that architecture, and by consequence in the photography. And I had found this picture of a group of children standing on a courtyard, and this kindergarten that he built has as a special quality is that all the furniture and everything is built around the size of children. It's not built around the size of adults. And I was struck about these young trees being a parallel for the young children, and especially the light and the shadows being quite low, and composing the few elements that are in this picture as forward-looking. And this is, of course, all of what modernity is about, is the promise of we do something now very quickly, and let's get it over with, and the future is going to be better. But of course, the future is always a problem, because in the end it becomes not an exercise on the future, but it becomes an exercise on the labor of today, and that we have to in fact suffer for the future. And the magical thing about photography is that it's one of these few tools that manage to effectively survive time while not giving up everything about its origins. It does effectively transport a number of ideas. It also loses a number of ideas. It ages, it goes out of fashion, it changes from black and white to color, etc. Clothes change, and you name it. Details change. But what it does carry on certain intentions. And the intentions of modernist black and white photography were often simple structures, rather contrasted pictures in which the future was clear. And so my idea was, how do you add another layer to this stillness that in fact unfreezes everything that lies in the picture? And I did nothing else than to Photoshop away the original trees that were in the picture and replace them with ones that I had found or that I had filmed on location, and then digitally master them into the picture. And movement is not so much movement, because movement, the way I conceive movement is, we still sort of tend to think of it in terms of forward going to a certain horizon. And I tend to think of movement more in, and probably this is why I work with digital media all of the time, because it allows to use a platform which is not forward moving, which is not regressing neither, and which is not standing still either, but which is somewhere cyclic, and where the movement becomes more of a caress of the surface. And I like this idea that movement would not be going from one place to the other, but would be in fact a massaging of the surface. And here we go again with what Adam was speaking about, the surface of the image a moment ago. Some installation pictures of kindergarten combined with another work which is titled Sections of a Happy Moment. That's part of the series. And I keep on sketching and drawing a lot when I get the time. So I'll go for another large leap. I think I'll actually make quite a jump. A moment ago we were in 1997, and now I'll jump straight to 2004 and show you some things about how Bordeaux Peace came about and why I did this work the way I did. And as you can imagine from seeing the pictures, I'm quite fascinated with how architectural photography deals with space, and but more essentially with people. It tends to be employed in order to remember and give a documentation on a particular place. And usually the human figure is used or abused as a mere scale, while in fact it is the object that is supposed to inhabit the place itself. So by gathering a lot of imagery on architectural photography, I started to become more obsessed with the lack of people and how they kept on being composed in architecture. And in fact, this became my sort of point of interest. So architecture is a sort of framework that I use, and you can find back that it, in fact, the figures that I use are composed in such a way inside architecture that they're not really free. They are composed by the camera and by the architecture. And in the case of sunrise, the maid is in fact all the time imprisoned in this extreme form of geometrical composition. And with Bordeaux Peace, I had the chance to visit a house of a woman that had this magnificent villa that overlooks the river Garonne and the city of Bordeaux. It's on a hill, and she had invited me to see if I could make, if I would be interested in a commissioned work. And as usual, I have something in the back of my mind when I visit a place, and this either fertilizes this encounter or not. In this case, it did. And I was, in fact, I was thinking about the project, and initially I wanted to film it in one of the houses of Pierre Koenig in Los Angeles, because that was sort of my reading of financial wealth and modernist minimalism combined together, and the luxury of living in the open. And in fact, it's quite pretentious if you think about it, is to the walls of your house are in fact your surroundings. They're not even any walls anymore, they're just glass, and the walls that are there give you minimal amount of privacy and structure to keep the roof afloat. So I transposed the idea that I had for this piece into the situation in Bordeaux. Now, because the house had been conceived for a man who was in a wheelchair, it was all about the feast of light. And he himself was physically not very able to move around. He had a library, which was centralized in the house, and then he had an elevator through which he could go through the various floors. And this elevator provided me with a fantastic piece of decor. I could put my film crane through it and move about 2 floors, and one wouldn't really notice how I was able to do this. So I was quite interested in using the house as a decor for light. And I had a secret agenda, and that was obviously not the story that's being told in the film. The story had one single purpose, and that is to keep you busy for enough time, not to run away, and to keep you sitting until you've seen the end of the story of the film, and which concludes to nothing. It's, in fact, if you think about it, it's about a haircut, or it's about a girl being seduced by the father of the son. And so I wanted to fill up about 10 minutes of time with what I call foreground, which seemed to be story, narrative. And in my work, narrative is always something to be dealt with in a not always very friendly way. So storytelling is something that I'm often working against almost. And my secret agenda was, in fact, the study of light in the background. And because the house was built in such a way, it provided for different enjoyments of shadow and light at different stages of the day. And so I set about doing these 2 things, composing and studying the light in and around the house, and writing a story that is a pure pretense. But as always, the story wins from the light, which of course any cameraman knows it's not true, but we tend to think it does. And the idea was to repeat almost, I think, 75 times the same film and make it appear like a loop, and as if life is repeated all over again, and it's, you know, this is what it goes on with films. Each time you look, it's the same dreaded thing. And what is hard to notice is that the actors in fact become very tired, and their acting skills diminish over the day, and to such an extent that they start making mistakes. So for those who are too, who are impatient, and you should be impatient because 14 hours is a long time, I have made a little compilation of I think 4 seconds of the beginning of each film, and I'm scrolling through the stills. These are the stills of 6 o'clock in the evening, and this is the 4-second sequence, and we'll listen to that. I have no sound. Sorry. Wait, I'm going to pause. I think I might have to switch back to... Just a second. No, I don't have a connection to the speakers here. So I think it has something to do with the device. It was not properly connected, so now it's okay. I think you can put the volume a little bit down. People might be shocked when they find out how loud it is. you can see the day coming up.
Half an hour. You call me. I'm leaving for Berlin in half an hour. You call me. I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. Yeah. What, me? I'm leaving for Berlin in half an hour. Me? Well, I'm leaving for Berlin in half an hour. Yes. Me? I'm leaving for Berlin in half an hour. Me? I'm leaving in half an hour for Berlin. Yeah. Now you call me. I'm leaving for Berlin in half an hour. Yeah. What, me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour? You call me. What, me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour?
You can see the light shifting.
I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour? Yes. What? I'm leaving for Berlin. In half an hour? What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. In half an hour? Yeah. What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour? What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour? Yes. What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour? Yes. What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour? What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour? What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour? What? Me? Yeah, I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. No. What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. What? Me? I'm going off to Berlin.
So, there's a. As you can imagine, this was it's more like marathon acting. It was my ideal revenge on cinema somehow, and I always say, photographs are films that keep their mouths shut, and I enjoy this silence that nevertheless always speaks somehow, and the way I work is quite low key, although it's a little bit like guerrilla. You do with very few people what you should do with with a big crew. And so we spent a month on location, hoping for good weather, which was not always obvious. But coming from the north of Europe, I imagined that south of France had eternally beautiful weather, which I had to learn the hard way is not true. So we spent obviously several weeks also waiting for the sun to reappear. And for those who, could be a little bit abstract in some cases to understand how it was filmed, I wrote the story together with the older actor who's Josse de Pauw. He's an excellent Belgian theater maker and actor. And he, in fact, his idea, the reason how I got him over to act for me was I had promised that he didn't have to work very hard, and that he would be able to write on a new novel, and he just knew he had to do some lines every day and that it was repetitive, but he didn't know he had to do 75 identical films, and so he found out slowly how it worked, but it was okay. Every 10 minutes he had to come out of his writer's house. And the dogmatic decision was that because the film lasts 10 minutes, we have to make a new one every 10 minutes. So after 10 minutes, the light has shifted a little bit, and then you really feel how you're in the service of light and not in the service of storytelling. And after those 10 minutes, we do the same shot from exactly the same composition, but with a different light, and obviously also with all the small details like the background noises which are changing over the course of the day. And there's a distinction between the film sounds and the background sounds. The background sounds, which are the sounds of city, car, mopeds, birds, dogs, even the gardien, say in French, the person who tends the house, appearing all of a sudden in an image without him realizing. All these things are just part of the background, and they were recorded too. And so we went about shooting each of those, I think it's 8 different types of shots, 75 times, but of course with all the mistakes and with the days where the light is not interesting enough, it's quite exhausting. And at the end of the production, everybody was fighting. This is the wall on which the actor is standing. It's very thin, so we had to double it so that because he had fear of heights, he wouldn't fall off. And I usually work with improvised stuff that I gather, and my studio is full of film equipment and photo equipment. And this is the hole in the floor, which is in fact an elevator going up and down, but I lowered it and I just put my crane through it. And the beauty of working with light as your sort of dictator is that you don't always control who's going to be in the picture. So the idea was that the end of the film is when it's so dark that we can no longer film, plus switching on the lights. So we had one shot, the last film in the piece, which is I believe around 9 o'clock or 9:30 in the evening, is it reveals the entire crew in the window because the lights go on. And this is a shot from the last scene. You can see here one of the actors in fact doubling as a sound man, and lots of periods of waiting for the right light or the right moment of the day. Tired actor. Tired me. So I think we can skip the video excerpts and go to the next piece which I would like to say a little more about, and that would be the Algiers sections of a happy moment. I did the Algiers sections of a happy moment as the last work in a series, which started with, well, it's a little bit, the titles are boring, I'm not the best title inventor. It starts with sections of a happy moment, and then it goes on with Arena, which is a work that I love very much, but because it has a lot of primary colors for one reason or another, it's often considered as not so important. But Arena is a study, in fact, is really about looking and looking back. It's really about one of the it's crucial for photography in a way. And then the last one was the Algiers sections of a happy moment, and in fact, politically it's maybe the more delicate one. I did it after living for years already in an area of Antwerp which is really occupied by, it's a Jewish neighborhood, but it's also like it's shared between immigrants also from Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, etc. And then young Belgian families that move in. And my neighbors are, there's a lot of these kids on the street which always looked a little bit suspicious, and you were never sure if, you know how it goes, how people in Europe look at young crooks whenever they see somebody standing a little bit too long in the street. And this is of course the tendency in Europe towards the children of immigrant families look at France, look at Belgium, look at England, and I wanted to do something with them. But it was difficult because I didn't really have a language base to work with them, and I wanted to do something with this suspicion that one, party has towards the other. And because I was the topic of the sections of a happy moment was precisely to work with an event that is of no rhetorical importance, namely throwing a ball in the air, or well, I worked quite a few times with balls, and because they're very easy indexes of movement being halted in the air. And in Alger sections of a happy moment, I transformed that from the basketball to birds. Birds are another very good index of motion or movement, because precisely the photographer can never be everywhere and shoot them from all different angles. And this is precisely what I wanted to do. So I had several ideas in my head, but I never know exactly how they're going to come out. And if I do have an internal picture, of course you don't know what the result is going to be. And with sections of a happy moment, I went about working not in Algeria, where the scene is set. This is set on the old roofs of the Kasbah. But I largely worked in studio, and the architecture was of course photographed on location during the month of, I think it's October or November, with quite low light, which is very handsome light somehow, and each day at the same time of the day with the same type of light. I had a photographer, an assistant, going out and shooting another perspective from the same point. And now, Adam mentioned a moment ago, he mentioned this centralized point, which is a way of making your life easy when you work with fragmented points of view, is to have a clear center around which everything seems to be orbiting. And with the birds, the uncontrollable quality that birds have are interesting in the way that this is precisely what I went about to do. And so the birds were gathered around the same period, but by the seaside. I've own-handed photographed between 4,000 and 5,000 seagulls from different points of view. Of course, I had no idea which point of view I had already shot. I was just shooting like a mitraillette. And I gathered and I organized movements of birds. And what came out of that was, of course, a classification of types of birds and similar movements. So by doing so, I could pretend to be everywhere and to have exactly the same bird in my view, but which was in reality another one, by coincidence doing the same movement with the wings. And the birds probably echo the idea of verticality, and they of course have probably something to do with Christian iconography also, in the sense that they are white, they are light, and they probably transport also something of the sky and maybe the heavens, and something difficult to grasp, a messenger in a way. And because the kids themselves are just standing on the street or on the roof and having nothing to do and just standing around, while one man feeds them, they become a kind of heaviness. And within photography this is important. When you see the first picture appearing, you have no idea that you are not in fact looking at photography. You have everything sort of appears coherent within the photographic reality. They appear to be elements of flesh and blood and people waiting for something to happen. Slowly, this waiting becomes reflected in your own position as a spectator. It becomes something that you're as well, a little bit not unlike Manet or Jeff Wall would be dealing with the relation with the viewer and the people depicted in the picture. And gradually, the idea that the photograph, which once must have been constituted of objects or people that are made of flesh and blood and reality, they become inert elements that have no soul, or that have no longer the blood vessels that are inherent in what. Well, this is a little bit of a metaphor, but in photography, we always seem to make a causal link between the man or the person who has been taking the picture and the element that's in front of the camera. And however well today we are aware that in fact this is always a construct and has always been, let's not forget, a construct, it's something in us refuses to believe so. And this is I think today it's a very important pivoting of how we perceive photography and the moving image in general. And slowly the people on the football field or on this roof, they start losing the photographic identity, and they exchange it for something that starts to feel like concrete, or something that's no longer living. And my exercise of balance is to have these two qualities going on hand in hand. And so there is a layer of a structural layer where no decision is being taken between the fiction and reality, but also no decision is being taken on a more political reading of the picture about who is in charge in the picture. Is it the birds or is it the people underneath it? They somehow are controlled by these beings that are floating above them, and by accident I just appropriated in fact the fence around them as an imprisonment, and obviously the Mediterranean Sea as the promise of a horizon. And these are things which, this is how I work. I don't work with this. These are all not ideas that I have ahead of the project in my mind. They just I just use them. And so out came 500 stills that depict a similar scene, which are entirely composed during a 1.5 year period. And you get situations like these, which I love a lot, where there's a conversation going on even between an arrogant bird and a man sitting on the wall. And because motion image has so much time, it's like the definition of having nothing to do is we sit down and look, and it's in fact something you can play with on another level. And the birds are this particular type of seagulls, which are often, they have these big white or yellow eyes, and they can be quite aggressive looking. They can be quite aggressive, in fact, if you decide them not to feed. So here are a few pictures of how I go about working. And the first stage is looking for the location. So all I had in mind was the idea that I wanted to do something with the kids that were on the street and who everybody thinks of their crooks. And so obviously I was going to set the piece somewhere also in a different area. And so I was looking on the internet and speaking with people, and in fact planning to shoot everything on location, including the people. But as I am really a studio freak and I love to work at home, because there's a tremendous amount of freedom also inside the control of light and what you can do with actors, I decided to split it up in 3 chapters: the birds, the location, and then the people. And these are shots from the location on the roof. And this is loosely drawn scheme of where the cameras had to come. And the reason why this roof was kind of suitable is because it has many different positions, higher, lower, far away, closer. And so we started to make a plan with where the cameras would go. And then a plan of how to photograph these tremendously huge digital photographs, while in fact having not enough pixels. So what I do is I zoom in. I start with a wide angle and I zoom in and I zoom in until I'm entirely on my subject, and comes out a slide that is a few gigabytes in size, which I can then in fact almost infinitely zoom into. Then this digital drawing that you see is a calculation of how to transpose the point of view from the roofs into the studio, making triangulations of angles. This is all rather complicated, but of course this is the pleasure of anybody who's busy with scenarios, is that you're always a step ahead of the person looking, isn't it? Then this is a selection of the central figure in, and he's in fact the owner of a restaurant next doors. And he was really very friendly looking man, and he's very photogenic. And I had no better idea than in fact to feed a piece of bread to the birds, because that's how I got to photograph them in the first place. So this is what came out. And then is a rough selection of people that I would think could form a family or friends, but of course they have nothing to do with one another. And this is the scene in the studio with a lot of blue key around it, and then here and there you can see photo cameras that are synchronized with one another, standing around. And they don't know what they're doing, and in fact I don't either. I usually work with not a very fixed plan. I improvise. I have a few perspectives in my head, but then I just look at the person in front of me and I try to do things with this person. And this is then what comes out. This is the person in the football goal. And these are the seagulls. This is a classification of movement, which is just a lot of hours spent working. And this is, thanks to the industry of film, is that they're always in a hurry and with a deadline, and the luxury of an artist is that I'm not. There's nobody waiting for my work, so I can spend as many years. And this should be, I think this is essential, that this is embedded in the work, that you can feel this, that there's no hurry. This is a screenshot of the final stages of editing. These are all the different images gathered on an editing line. And then a little bit of the digital compositing process, but then I'm going to go on, I suppose, because just a lot of Photoshop work. And the problem with this is that you can't ask a lot of. I work with a number of assistants, but it's very intensive work. And I'm interested in the non-conflict, because there's so much of the conflict available that, in fact, I might as well work on another horizon. These are all the names of the figures. And then some of the installation shots. When it comes to installing simple installations, it's the good thing is that you don't have to, in fact, spend weeks on location in the museum or the gallery to be busy with producing the work. but the work exists, and then it's a matter of making the people who are going to look at it comfortable enough to and not to physically harass them. The difference with the cinematic situation where you would be, or the cinema situation, sorry, where you are immobile, and the museum is that you can freely walk around. So the museum has more to do with the park, with the idea, the 19th century idea of strolling through the park on a Sunday afternoon, than it has to do with cinema. But obviously cinema is the dominating language, and the museum offers, the museum is not much else than a platform in which those two realities can go into a dialogue, but without committing an assault on the viewer. So if I can avoid stories, I will. If I can avoid forcing you to sit a number of minutes in front of the work, I will. And so one should be free to stroll around, to come in and out, and to get bored in a way. This is part of your right. And this is an installation with transparent screens, which I've been using since my exhibition at the Centre Pompidou in Paris, where the walls are not fixed, but are made out of a transparent material, and I project on them. And part of the projection, of course, stops on the screen, and you can see the image crystallizes. But another part of the image goes on to bounce back on the walls and the elements and people. And of course, this has its limitations, but the beauty of it is that you can. The projector light is not so much a tool to project a film, but it becomes really a source of light. It becomes something that shines in your eye and that even illuminates the space itself. And I quite like that idea that there's not so much the black walls and then this one spot of light which is lit up here and there, and which is in fact quite fatiguing, but that the projector light is employed as a sunlight. And electrical light is essentially what made any cathedral or any place where light had a vertical function not necessary anymore. Electrical light is what took over more or less everything. And I like to give back a little bit of a natural aspect to that electrical light by making it pretend it to be a replacement for the sun. And it's almost a metaphor for the outside world. And so many of my pieces are around simple natural phenomena, as you might have noticed: the wind, the sun, water resembling ice. I'm now going over to say a few things about sunrise. And sunrise is the work with which is initially very dark looking. I got the idea while working at on the Bordeaux piece, and again the apparent subject was a house. And I had a secret agenda, and I started looking for locations from 2004 until 2008, when I finally found Skywood House, which is a private villa located outside of London. on the English countryside, and which has as a main quality that it tries to be a Mies van der Rohe house. And so it's very dogmatic in it wanting to be minimal and simple in idea and structure. And so I visited several places in Czechia, France again, Belgium, forgot, Spain, Belgium, Spain, Dresden, France, Poland, and then finally Skywood House. And the problem with finding a house was that it had to be a wannabe house. So it couldn't be a monument house. It couldn't be Villa Savoie by Le Corbusier, because then it would the star would be the house. And this is the problem often with places. Take the house next door, which is a star museum building, and it's still to be seen how much the artist will be able to take over the star. So it had to be a house that was in line with a certain thinking, but a recent house. So when I found this place, I thought, okay, this one really could do the job. It's both generic and very specific. And because what I was looking for was a place to film a story with a Romanian maid. I don't know why I had always in my mind a Romanian maid, but she turned out to be a Romanian person, and really by coincidence, who is a cleaning lady at Tate Britain. And she was in fact quite a natural actress. So I was quite happy with that. And the only thing she needed to do was to do certain jobs for wealthy people who are asleep. But she needed to do them in such a darkness that our eyes, would adapt to this dark situation and would ultimately be confronted with a very bright light at the end of the film. Which is, when you think about what a silly light, projector light is I think quite a striking phenomenon. Our brain tells us that the light is bright, but it's not. It's just as weak as the dark situation was, but it's just because we see a sun, it tells us it might be of danger to our pupils, and so it does something in the reaction. And this has been, I've been using this idea of brightness quite a lot. And so after that, when I found the house and I visited, I drew up a storyboard. Well, actually, this is drawn up by one of my assistants, because my drawing is better. But his one was more effective for the story. He was a filmmaker and I'm not, so I'm a would-be filmmaker. And so we set about, in fact, going for a week on location in England, and did the film, which was quite pleasant. The only unpleasant thing was that there was no heating in the house, and it was the degrees were below zero. But essentially, there's still color in the pictures. I don't think much comes across in this projection here, but I pay attention that I project on a dark surface and not on white, because white is really rather an interesting surface. And with these projectors nowadays, and this is something I've been doing for years, they really benefit from being projected on a dark surface. And this is me opening the door by lack of having another actor, but it's also a little bit of it stands for me being the negotiator between the rich and the poor somehow. And then she goes about doing her job, and the thing that's recurrent in the work is that she has no freedom. She is not allowed, you don't feel that immediately, but she is just composed by the camera. And the camera is moving all the time, and the compositions are moving all the time. The geometry is constantly changing. But she's not. She's just doing her job, she's doing simple tasks. In fact, it's really something to fall asleep with, which is not a bad thing, I think, in art. If it allows you to look, it should also allow you to sleep with it. And then at one point, the owner or somebody in the house wakes up and goes to the loo, significantly, puts on the light. There's a little stripe of light, again very controlled, as she brings in the wood, and by the time she's inside, he's switching off the light and goes back to bed. And then she starts cleaning about the windows, outside and inside. So it had to be a place which appears to be a museum and owned by a freak, this person that tolerates no piece of dust. And then she even starts cleaning the outside of the house, which is a little bit, she starts cleaning the terrace. And then again she composes, and she has one brief moment of for herself, and that she's lighting up a cigarette. And I don't think I have the entire cigarette scene, because that's really, how long does it take? A minute? Depends on who, but it's 25 seconds, something like that. And then she puts out the trash, again composed, never, never, never out of composition. Then she refreshes the towels, does the library, makes the coffee, puts 3 cups and 3 dishes, waits until the coffee is whistling, and that's one of the few sounds in the film, in fact. And then she goes off, and there comes the second phase of the film, where darkness is replaced for light, but the darkness that we were in up until now is modern darkness. It's, in fact, it should be transparent and visible, but it's treated as a museum object. And what she does is she rides off towards her so-called bucolic village in a distance, and her day starts. So it's a exchanging of labor for leisure time, combined with an exchanging of composition for romanticism, if I put it generally speaking. And on top of that, I used, of course, Rachmaninoff to end the scene. And I must admit that the idea of the film was the piece of music to start with, and sometimes soundtracks will come as sort of signals from a distance, which I then have to unravel and add the film to it. And of course it ends with a lot of light. So for me the fascinating part was how to work with something that is in popular minds very accepted, but Rachmaninoff and this contrast between dark and light is, in fact, for the person with taste, is a little bit tricky. And I nevertheless wanted to make it work, and despite its sort of handicaps. These are some production shots. A lot of molten, black molten involved as well. During the day, some shots had to be done by evening fall. Not everything could have been done entirely at night, because you have so many reflections and you have to use light which you can't hide when you have so much windows. That's so. By day we tried out the scenes, and by night we were essentially shooting them. This is almost my crew. It's not a lot of people. So, since I've been doing, after the Quiet Shore, I embarked on a few projects that I was dreaming about for a long time, and one also has a soundtrack. Is based upon a piece of music for which I bought the rights recently, and this piece of music has as a quality that it puts you to sleep. It was designed by the composer for people who need to be relaxed. So who either visit a hospital and are in stress, or just buy a CD. You know, it was in the mid of the 80s. This became very popular, and so he wrote his music end of the 80s, and even long before I started with my film and photography work, I already was fascinated with this piece of music. It lasts about 11 minutes, but it's so anti everything that's tasteful that it nevertheless generates really, really strong images somehow. And so I'm almost finishing it now. We're rendering out the images. The rendering of the images in the computer takes about half a year. And because it's entirely CGI, computer-generated imagery, and because the subject is that you see is a forest, it's of course also the most complicated subject to put into scene with a computer, because it's so organic. And since I've been doing that work, which we are now sort of, we have rendered out almost 5 minutes, I think, now, of the 11, and I will probably premiere it in Paris around this time next year. And the other work that I've been embarking on since then is titled "The Oil Workers of the Shell Company of Nigeria." It's a very long title. The Oil Workers of the Shell Company of Nigeria returning home after work. And the rest of the title is not yet defined, but it goes something like they are being caught up in monsoon rains or torrential rains or heavy rains. And for years I was trying to embark on this delicate topic, which is Africa, and the fact that as a former sort of colonial power, Belgium, I have really nothing to say about Africa, and particularly in the Congo. I was looking for a picture to do precisely that, to speak about it. And but I wanted to do that in a structural way, in a material way, not in a clearly narrative position. And obviously when you think about the tags that are associated with Africa, essentially you think about misery, drought, death, and lack of water. And at one point I discovered this this picture, which sort of was a solution to my problem, because it was a picture about too much water and not about drought. But before I come to that, I quickly jump back to the Quiet Shore. And the Quiet Shore it resembles a little bit the series with the sections of A Happy Moment, but it adds something. I was thinking about, essentially about temperature and water, and what they do with one another. So it becomes ice and coldness. Warm becomes cold, and water becomes ice. And silver is part of photography's history as no other medium is, or no other material is. And the silvery shine of the shore that I was working on was in fact my main sort of fascination. And at one point I, again being invited to do something in a villa of a collector, I felt more attracted to do something with the beach, which was not so far away. And I will skip the video excerpt, of course. And I, the interesting part of the beach is that it has extreme tides, low and high. And when it's low tide, the water soaks so deep in the sand that it really reflects the world around it. And by coincidence, the bay is really almost 300 degrees around the water. So it reflects all these houses and all the people that are on it. And a moment ago I was speaking about birds being the index of movement, but in fact the seashore is another element like this. It's always ongoing. You can never, in fact, make it stop. And I was fascinated with what happens if, in fact, I produce an artifice, which is the sea as a lake, which is so quiet that it starts to behave as if it were a photograph on another level than one would expect naturally to happen. And so to create something that is, from the beginning, when you encounter the work, it looks artificial. It's an impossibility. And this added stillness becomes really a sort of problem almost. And this is installed in Vienna at the Secession, where I sort of exaggerated the phenomenon by putting a mirror floor in front of the work. So let me see. With the Quiet Shore, I don't have. Yeah, but the Quiet Shore, I don't have. Unfortunately, I don't have my installation pictures in it. My production pictures, but it was essentially made like like the Algiers sections of A Happy Moment was made. First, spending a week by the beach, and then building, in fact, a beach in my studio with a big tent, a white tent around it, and then putting children and essentially kids in it, and photographing them with all my cameras in and outside. And of course the splash is at the end, which I didn't conceive like this in the beginning. I thought I could mix them, but because the splash gives away so much of movement and halted movement, I kept it for the end. Now I go on to the last, if you can still bear with me, the last few things, which are basically 3 projects. Is travel, and travel is the work with the piece with the terrible music. So my aim with this work is no less than to make you feel comfortable and take a nap, and then wake up at the end. And it's going to be approximately 12 minutes. I started the idea in 1996, and I'm going to finish it hopefully in 2013. And it's really, this is the first draft. It's a scene in a forest, and it starts at the outside of the forest in a park, and the camera goes inside of the forest. And ultimately the camera goes back out of the forest and the music ends. So I'm not going to terrorize you with more of this music, but what's important is that it's divided in a chapter where you get acquaintance to the music, where it relaxes you or irritates you, and where the whole scene becomes very dark, and where, of course, the impulse is also to relax, and at the end the camera goes back out of this forest, which by the end has become a monumental, almost Amazonias like forest, but which then appears to be a teeny tiny bush somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And it's a play between your expectations and the space that you've been looking at and assuming it's coherent. And while at the end, when the réveil scène is there, when the music becomes more grand, it's in fact just a disappointment. But the sensations of disappointment and excitement go hand in hand. This is the goal of the work. And what you see here is nothing more than what we call a clay model of a scene, and then its sort of final output. This is still before correction, so we still have to correct all the light. But you can sort of feel this is generic, and that's important. It shouldn't be something, shouldn't be a particular forest. It should be something that lives in your mind or lives in the computer. And just to, this is technical absurdity because it's a lot of work. It's much more work than all the other works that you've seen before combined. And this is a small creek being designed, and one would assume that this all goes automatic, but it's really the opposite. It's hand drawing from beginning to end. So what I do is I always make the drawings first, and then comes the artist who built it in geometrical forms, and then it slowly starts to take shape. This is a scene where in the music they have this instrument called it's a rain stick. It's this thing that you do like that, and it's a very kitschy sound, in fact, but it's supposed to start to tingle your nerves and to wake you up again. That's the point. And I associated that, of course, with water. So in the picture, in the film, it gets its counterpart in water. And this work really might be the end of my career. Is if people don't get it, then it might really be as if I've hit a mental low somehow. These are some stills of the river scene completed, but without the water. This is still a dry bedding, and in fact CGI goes pretty much the same way as any other type of photography or mise en scène. It's just that you have more control over it, but the light and everything else really exactly mimics that of nature. This is this artificial looking thing is a simulation of water, and this really goes like you open the tab and it comes out. It takes months for the computer to calculate this. It's the same technology as well, I was told by the guy who designed this. It's the same technology as well, many of Pixar, and but they never used such a long, so many minutes of water. And then are more accomplished stills of the beginning shot, again with the annoying sound, which I'll put off again, but it shows you some steps of the movement. It's hard to give an idea of what it will look like if you don't have the moving image, of course. But it pretty much starts looking like it could exist. The funny thing is that you look for something generic that's of no importance whatsoever, and it takes you. It's much easier, in fact, to build something that looks exciting and special with a particular light. And this is the inner scene. We call this the cathedral scene. This is the scene that is supposed to establish this sense of size of the forest and how huge it is, and it is in fact really not a small bush or a park, but it's quite monumental. And then shortly after that comes the exit scene, where the camera, with monumental sounding music, comes out backwards, and right up until the end, you expect it to be grand. You expect it to come to fantastic closure. But what it does, it reverses the roles. The music kind of mounts up to something almost climatic at the end, which is really associated with light, and so does the camera. The camera comes out, and the camera literally moves above, orbits above the forest, and it's light, so it kind of tingles your eyes again. But in the same moment, the scene collapses entirely. It's going to be a silly forest, of which the reference is in at the border of Wallonia and France, in Belgium. So it's between acres and houses. It's of no importance whatsoever. And the other project that's nearing completion is the work with the long title. And this is the image that I used as my reference, precisely because it has this relation between oil and water, between two materials that don't really go together by nature. And my idea is to make an animation of this portrait of 50 people standing, sheltering underneath this bridge, on their way somewhere, but stuck by rain, and for once not by war or by drought. And so I start studying the appearance in photography of oil and water. And I gather a lot of images of both materials, and I mix them until I no longer see the difference. And I can no longer tell what is water and what is oil. Okay. And out of that comes a draft, which is just trying to figure out what the speed of the film will be. We call that a clay model. It's really like CGI incorporates everything that the other traditional arts have as well. And then the next stage is to start building in the studio a scanner, which is consists out of photo cameras, so it's not really a scanner. It's 25 still cameras, high resolution, with a lot of light. It becomes a tunnel, and a figure, which I just get them off the street and ask them to pose for me. And then ultimately I have this intermediate between photography and 3D, which is a figure that you can see from all sides, but still it feels made of flesh and blood. And this is roughly what comes out at the other end of the production line. And then this is the scene itself without people, and slowly being populated by people until we get this. And this is more or less where we are. We're now going to start adding the light and the reflections. And so it's going to be essentially a study about materials, which ultimately, if you give it time to stay, transforms into something quite different. And I should stop here. Thank you all for coming.